Hi, friend.
Hey.
Welcome back to Justice to our listeners and our viewers. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling so grateful. We had our first Boston live event, live podcast taping last night. And thanks and shout out to everyone who joined and kind of engaged with us. It was incredible.
Yeah, it was moving. And at the end, it started to feel like a sister circle. It was this just amazing energy and community that I feel like we missed during the pandemic, right?
And
it's
we
nice.
kind of miss as adults.
Oh, for sure.
And also an incredible opening for our new private community that launched yesterday as well.
And we will get to that in just a moment. But let's talk about today's episode. It is about cults and high control groups. Some might call them highly coercive groups. What those groups are, how they may be showing up in our lives in ways that we had not known prior to today's episode, for example. And also, we have a guest who is someone who we both definitely find to be very inspiring, India Oxenberg, who spent time, many years actually, in the Nxivm cult led by Keith Raniere.
Yeah, we're so grateful to India for sharing her story and her resilience and all of the power that she has brought to her activism in her life post Nxivm. But before we get into the episode, just a trigger warning for this episode is quite heavy. This episode contains themes of suicidal ideation, eating disorders, sexual abuse, and highly coercive groups. So if any of those things are too much, always feel free to speed through or not listen or watch. We will provide resources in our show notes, but take care of yourself as always, guys.
So we are going to skip some of the things that we typically do, right, Em? Because we really think it's important to spend as much time as possible with today's guest and to really dive as deeply as we can into this topic. And so what we're actually going to jump to is something that you just mentioned, which is today's sponsor. Today's sponsor, it's actually us.
We sponsored us.
We sponsored the sponsor, which is us.
League. The Justice League sponsored the Just Us podcast.
Exactly.
That is also supported by
Justice. Absolutely. Who happens
Justice
to just
Productions
be just
LLC.
Us. All the things Justice, you all want to join our new private community. It is a space, a resource, a hub for all things justice. Let's be honest, like the algorithm fakes on us every single day. I post things and people are like, oh, I haven't seen you in months, or how have you been? Or I didn't know you did the thing. And I'm like, girl, I've been posting 5 times a week, right? So it's quite possible that you are not seeing our content depending on the platform. It will be a repository for all of our reels, all of our episodes, and other important information that relates to justice.
The private community will have monthly live chats, extra episodes that are not available for public consumption. There will be a repository, as you said, of all of our content, and there'll be ongoing monthly discussions around books that we choose, documentaries, film, TV series. There'll also be a intentional private aspect to the community. So for those who really want to engage, particularly around some of these sensitive subjects that we talk about, but don't want to do so on a public forum, this will be the opportunity to do that.
For sure. And this group is going to be very time sensitive, right, Em? I mean, we want to make sure that we have certain caps in place so that people can form relationships and truly be vulnerable and have the kind of community that we believe the podcast deserves and is a natural byproduct of it as well.
What are you most looking forward to in the private community?
I'm actually looking forward to more daily, weekly interaction. You know, obviously you and I are sitting here having a conversation, just the two of us. But the reason that the live tapings are so dope is because there's a element of call and response.
Yeah.
We hear back from the audience.
And one of the things that was so incredible, even about last night, which is our second event in Boston, there were so many people who had been at our first event who wanted to keep talking about some of the subjects that we mentioned at the first event and went into last night's event, and as well as the event we had in DC.
Yeah.
So it just kind of gives us this glimpse of what a community that's following along and having these conversations in their own life and with us can do.
Absolutely. So we will have all of the information down in the show notes about how to join. Again, joining will be time sensitive, so make sure you hop on it if you want to be a part of the Justice League. So we are so excited today to talk about a subject that actually Margot and I we started talking about last year or the year before as we started our lunchtime
Yeah,
chats.
we did. I think in early mid 2021.
So things have definitely come full circle because we're so excited to have with us today India Oxenberg.
Amazing.
Margot, tell us a little bit about our guest.
So, India, thank you so much for joining. I am so incredibly grateful and excited for this conversation that is very much a continuation and hopefully will be an ongoing conversation with you too, between me and Tashira, and this idea that we've talked a lot about coercive control and how people end up in situations that they might not expect, and in sometimes in cults like you did. And so before we begin, I just want to orient our listeners and viewers a little bit about your bio. India is an American actress and documentary film producer. From 2011 until 2018, India was involved in the Nxivm, an American multi-level marketing company that was later exposed as a cult. When in Nxivm, India was introduced to a secret group called DOS and was later groomed to be a sexual partner of Keith Raniere. In 2020, she published the book Still Learning, a memoir. She also produced and stars in a documentary series called Seduced Inside the Nxivm Cult, which details her time in Nxivm. India is also an incredible activist, continuing her work working with survivors of cults and other coercive groups. She works a lot with the large national nonprofit called RAIN, and she does a lot of talks and education around consent. So we're going to touch on all of that today, and just want to thank you again, India, for joining us in the Justice podcast.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, India. So the first thing we want to talk about is how you define yourself, because I think much of the narrative, India, around you and your time in Nxivm and DOS, I feel, and I don't know if you would agree, is very disempowering to who you are as a survivor and as a person. How do you define yourself?
It's a really good question. You know, I think what's helped me the most is that I've had to recognize that I had actually lost myself at a certain point. And so in order to like reclaim who I am, I've actually had to go through like quite a big shedding process of the person that I thought that I was, because I so strongly identified with the cult version of myself that had been indoctrinated. And so coming out, it was like I felt almost like a new person, which felt incredibly vulnerable and also like self-protective. So any shred of who I thought I was really holding on to like a tight grip of that, even if it didn't serve me. So I feel like the version that I am now is the closest to my authentic self. Like, and I think it's silly to use those words sometimes because I think they get kind of overused. But I just feel like your most authentic self is basically you with less fear. So if I imagine myself saturated in fear, basically making decisions not for my benefit and also out of my right mind for a number of reasons that we'll go into later, including like sleep deprivation, food deprivation, and also just like rhetoric. I was not me. And that wasn't the version of me that I had kind of imagined that I would be as a child. So I kind of used that reference point of the version of myself that I thought before I kind of got fucked up, if you will. So I go back to that point because I feel like it's kind of the most pure, like your heart's desires of who you wanted to be when you were little. And of course, a lot has changed for me since the time I was 7. But I do think like I've had to just go backwards to really find myself now, if that makes sense.
It does.
Can you, for people listening who, it totally makes sense, and it's a beautiful kind of orientation to where you are now. What are some of those things that you reclaimed that you had lost while you were in Nxivm?
How about let's just start with freedom. Yeah, so like that was something that's taken me a long time to actually recognize, like for me to actually say, and I'm going to use these words intentionally, but that I was a branded sex slave is like a lot. to take in when you've been told the whole time that you were there that this was for your best interest, this was for your growth, this was, for you to really get to know yourself more deeply, when really, on the contrary, it's just slavery. And and it's basically taking somebody's free will and actually stripping them of their wants, needs, and desires and replacing them with the wants and needs and the desires of the leadership. And you don't even really see that happening. You just think that that's your choice, when it's not. So I think that's the part that's been most difficult for me, is to see how many choices I made that were not for my best interest. And it's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. Let's go back a bit, India, because while I think Margot and I have been like steeped in a lot of the news and documentary series, podcasts, all the forms of media about Nxivm, there are people who will listen today who are not familiar. So
Right.
can you tell us about Nxivm and then fill us in about what DOS was?
Definitely. So Nexium, like you said earlier, was a multi-level marketing company, but really they positioned themselves as their consumer front product, which was a self-help program called ESP, um, and executive success programs. And that was basically their recruiting tool. And so what they would do is they would go out and they would do intro presentations, mostly with people, who had some kind of either status or notoriety, like whether it was actors or sons of presidents or people that you may not question because they already kind of have established some authority in your mind. So that was part of their marketing tool, to just get to higher network people. So basically, what they did was they had these intro presentations, and part of that was to recruit people into a 5-day program. And that was the beginning of their indoctrination tool. And on the surface, it kind of looked like every other self-help group. But the truth is, the more that I got into it and the deeper I became involved as a coach, the more nefarious it became, but also I was totally unaware of those red flags at the time because I was surrounded by people who I thought were my friends, who I thought were colleagues, who I thought were on the same mission as me. Then basically, when I became a coach, they targeted me to be a coach. I guess I showed a lot of signs of somebody who would be a good recruiter, but I also never ever thought of myself as someone who would want to be a coach because I grew up in Los Angeles, and like the last thing on my mind was putting like life coach on my resume. Not that that's like something to diss, but it just was not what I was looking for. Like I had just, done a bunch of odd jobs, and I was 19 years old, and I was like looking to pursue production because that's what I wanted to do. But when I got into the group and then into the coaching program, that's when I started to notice that like anything that I liked that was contrary to the group's needs and desires was automatically like a no. And basically it was either like superficial, or it was about my attachments, or it was about pleasing my family. So like anything that I actually wanted was a negative. That is a red flag that I did not notice at the time. Wasn't until more or less 5 years later that, so a slow burn, if you will, that I was invited by Allison Mack to join a group called DOS. Um, and that was basically the cult within the cult, and a harem of women that Keith was curating and basically having them sign away their lives to something that they thought was going to make them stronger. But you don't get from, sitting in a room listening to an intro presentation to saying yes to DOS overnight. Like there's a tremendous amount of grooming and so much pressure to actually think that these decisions are good. So that's the part that is the most difficult, I think, to explain. But I like to just kind of bring it back to an abusive
Yeah,
relationship because I feel like that's the easiest thing to understand.
It's so interesting because as you were talking about just kind of the grooming and you don't get from point A to point D overnight and the lack of power and autonomy and the minimizing, denying, and blaming you for your feelings or for how your approach it sounds like all of the signs of an intimate partner violent relationship, right? Like you look at the power and control wheel and the emotional abuse, the financial abuse, the isolation, the sexual abuse, the gaslighting, using male privilege, like all of the
Yeah,
things
all of it.
you experienced on an ongoing basis from an individual, but also from an organization.
And then how about on top of it, you get all the, the love bombing, which is so confusing and really adds to the Stockholm syndrome that one needs to recover from because at a point like you love the people that you live with, even if they're abusing you, the same way that a woman who is in a domestic abuse situation loves her abuser, as well as recognizing that she's being abused, which can take a really long time to even recognize that. But you waffle in the, well, he's so nice to me sometimes, and like when he picks up the groceries, it's so lovely, but when he hits me, I mean, maybe I deserve it. Like it sounds crazy when you're saying it out loud, but the truth is it's the same system and also the same symptoms that the victim gets to deal with.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm happy that you all brought up the parallels to intimate partner violence because I think a lot of the narrative around what it means to be in cults or highly coercive groups is that those people are weak, they were easy to be manipulated or brainwashed. It's all of these negative tropes and narratives around these individuals. It's not the same thing for victims of intimate partner violence. And so maybe if well, I think there are
It's a
times for
good
sure,
question.
but I think that we have a larger
Yeah.
movement
Yes,
around
so
intimate
I
partner
think there's a lot
violence,
more. I agree. I
right?
think there's a lot
I
more
just think there's so much shame.
yes, and I think well, there's a lot more prevalence of right. 1 in 3 people are
Yeah,
impacted by intimate partner violence, while a lot of people are impacted by highly coercive groups. It's not that high. So,
it's not as
and
high.
there's also a I agree with you, like a morality aspect where people are like, well, that's on a different part of the country, or this is for people who are really weak or are searching to be told what to do, as opposed to being brainwashed.
Well, it seems like there has been a movement in the DV or intimate partner violence field that does not necessarily exist in the same way when we talk about cults and highly coercive
Not
groups.
yet.
But I know that
Uh,
India's work is changing that.
not yeah, not yet. But I do agree with you, and I think that the tricky part is that in high control groups, not everybody is sexualized. So
Can you talk a
yeah,
little bit
you
about
so I
that?
yeah, I mean the difference between the stat like you can't really compare the stats, although you can sort of see the similar patterns and process, which can probably help you if you are someone out there who is experiencing abuse to just raise a flag and go, maybe this isn't good for me, but in your own time. Um, in in cults, it would be very unusual that the cult leader is having sex with everybody. Like, that's too suspicious. You know what I mean? Like, unless you decide that you're joining a polyamorous group and you're like intentionally agreeing to that lifestyle, and maybe you live in like an alternative commune life or something like that. I'm not here to judge people's decisions, but usually the cult leader will select who he wants to have sex with, and it's the same way that a predator identifies a victim. They're looking for people who are vulnerable. They're looking for people who have emotional vulnerabilities already, probably have already been sexualized before, probably don't have good boundaries. And there's a whole bunch of things that predators are really good at identifying in other victims that if you're not looking at people like that, you're not even going to be able to see that.
The predator in this case, you mentioned his name Keith, but
Mhm.
Keith Raniere, can you just situate him in all of this Nxivm DOS? Like, who is this person?
And who are his people around him?
Yeah.
Who is he? Who is Keith Raniere? Well, he is in jail now for 120 years in Tucson amongst his peers in the pedophile uh, section of his prison. So he's finally amongst company. But I think he's the type of person that really is a megalomaniac. Like I just never really knew that type of person. Like I had been around a bunch of narcissists. I mean, I grew up in Hollywood. It's pretty typical. Like I had a pretty good sense of like, oh, okay, that person thinks that they're God, but not like to the extent of
Not
what I
like
was gonna
God
deal with
God.
Keith. Yeah, not like
Like,
God. I was like,
The smartest person in the world.
yeah, and so like even when he was saying those things, which he actually rarely did, I mean, he didn't really say those things about himself that much. He had other people spreading propaganda about him in his favor. Um, because he's just a guy who wanted power and control and saw that he could con people into believing that he was something special. And, I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, and he kept pointing out, he's like, don't fault the victim, like praise the con because the con was good and the con worked. And so that's why I don't usually say, "Ah, oh, Keith, he's a fucking idiot," because like he's not. He was smart enough to be able to con a whole bunch of other really intelligent, highly educated people into believing that he had some superior knowledge. And that was part of his play. So I think that his play just ran out because he got incredibly greedy and also increasingly more violent. And, you know, that's when stuff started getting into the news. And that's when my mother actually needed to interfere. But before that, like he had been doing this for well over 20 years.
to,
Not DOS specifically, but multiple cons that also had an undercurrent of I'm gonna possess and control you. So like that was kind of his MO for a long time.
was there any value? I don't know if that's the right word. Like any legs to the curriculum, or was it a total cover? Was it valuable for people, the people who weren't targeted?
You know, I love answering this question now because I've been out for 5 years, and so I feel like I do have a pretty good uh I just have more objectivity about what I learned and now that I've been out in the world and I've, worked with other therapists and um, met with a bunch of other survivors who have also shared like what their curriculums were about in their groups, and they're all different. I would say that it was actually quite valuable. And I didn't think that really at the time. I was like, what am I doing here? Like, am I ever going to get out of this thing? Like, they keep telling me I need more education, and I really believed that. So I continued. Um, but I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about myself after the fact, but also while I was there. But in order for something to really work, it can't be an entirely bogus con. Like it has to have shreds of truth and things that actually make sense to you logically in order for you to really rationalize why you would stay or tolerate the level of discomfort or pain that you're experiencing. So in the case of Nxivm, there was enough that kept people engaged and also like mentally stimulated. It was a very like heady group. Like basically they were like, cut your head off from your body. Your intuition means nothing, and we're only going to use logic and science. And the only person who's mystical is Keith. But like you can't like God, you can't like spirituality, you can't like crystals. Like I remember hiding little trinkets for myself just as reminders of my past, but I felt so ashamed because I was like, oh, I don't want anyone to know that I like this because I already knew that anything that wasn't conforming to the group's standards wasn't going to be accepted.
And as you worked your way up through the curriculum, India, did you have to pay for it or did you get paid as an employee?
I never made money while I was there for 7 years. So the way that
Wow.
I mean, like maybe like $100 here and there on odd jobs or like nannying or cooking for people and stuff like that that I ended up doing because I did need the money. But there came a point where I started to just do everything on exchange. And because it's kind of communal living, you can get by on a pretty low income because there's people who are willing to like host you in their house for a small rent or like a work exchange, and that's kind of like the way the community works, a little bit bartery. And so I kind of liked that in my 20s. Like I was just sort of I didn't have very many responsibilities. I had, my stuff in my suitcases and then some things in my mom's home. But more or less, I was kind of like a gypsy, like not really thinking about my future. Obviously, I was being indoctrinated to also not think about my future in a more
But
normal way.
but also another way to keep you stuck.
Exactly. And to make me believe that the only thing that was going to help me was them and their curriculum. So they actually create dependencies on them while they isolate you from your other life.
Yeah. So when we kind of checked in before today's episode, India, I talked about my time in a high control group, which I don't talk about a lot at all because I'm still quite honestly healing from it. But the person who was the leader was also my abuser. And while we were nowhere near the size of a Nxivm or other cults, I mean, this was a small group. But when you talk about the hook and the bait oftentimes being the thing that makes sense, that's what I
Mhm.
think we miss from the conversation. You didn't walk into, as you said, a sex cult where you got branded, right? I didn't walk
No, I
into,
never even watched porn. Like,
right?
I'm serious. Like, I was 19. If
You're
I
a
look back at
baby.
myself, I'm like, oh my
You're
God,
a
I'm so
child.
innocent.
Yeah,
You were, because you were a
Yeah.
child.
because you were. Yeah, and I didn't walk
Yeah.
into it into that either. And so what I want people to take away from our conversation, which is so important to me, is that these could be faith-based institutions, they could be jobs, they could be interpersonal relationships. There are parts of this that could apply to anyone at any time in their life because of the
Completely.
vulnerability.
It could even look like a legitimate business, like it did in the case of Nexium. On the outside, it looked pretty normal. It wasn't until I actually moved to Albany and started to relate with the people who kind of originated the group. You asked earlier if it was just Keith. It wasn't just Keith. Keith had a whole group of mostly women, although it was pretty 50-50, probably a little heavier on the women's side, which I also find kind of interesting with these groups. A lot of single mothers, a lot of people who really needed support and were looking for community to get that kind of support. And you can't really fault somebody for wanting that. It's totally natural. So it just is like about what are your emotional vulnerabilities and what are you willing to trade in order to get that security? Because in my case, it was a lot.
But then also, I'm so happy Margot asked the question about the value that came out on the other side of it because we also can't dismiss that, right? There are parts of ESP or whatever it may have been that you experienced that you find valuable on the other side. With me, I think my orientation around critical race theory and the work that I do, my activism was rooted in that time with that group. And I don't want to dismiss the value either.
Right, and it's not really about the leader in that case. It's more about the information that you're getting because I didn't go to Nexium for Keith. Like I couldn't give two shits that he was apparently the smartest man in the world. All they were saying was, "We have tools to get over your fears and to be able to achieve your goals easier." And I was like, "Well, I'm a very fearful and anxious person, so I could use that." And so it was kind of like they fed into an emotional vulnerability that I had, which really was about the fact that I'm dyslexic and I've, grown up with learning disabilities. And I always considered myself daft in certain ways. And so I was kind of like looking for somebody to say, like, hey, you're smart. Like, I'll be your daddy. I'll be your mentor. Like, let me help you out, little girl. And like, I just trusted that that person who would be there for me would be somebody that was good. I didn't think that going into this group, they were talking about the fact that they were humanitarians. Like all of these things that spoke to me, probably similar in your case. Like we want to build community. We want to spread this education. And it's not that Keith was original in his education whatsoever. Actually, he stole everything from everybody else, from the Stanford Prison Project to freaking Buddhist philosophies. Like it was not him. It was things that he had sourced that actually have legitimacy.
I heard that much of the curricula was plagiarized from many other places.
Yeah, and then he would slip in his manipulation into that. So like you have to break somebody down enough to be able to then implement other beliefs. Like if I told you that your hair was purple, you would say, no, it's not. But if I like work you enough to actually start to be like, okay, okay, my hair is purple. Like that's a silly example, but that is kind of like the same process of how you can get somebody to just accept beliefs that may not be authentic.
I also think it's so important because one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're both talking about your experiences is how so many groups or organizations, while maybe not a coercive, a controlled group or a cult, have aspects of this in the sense that people are searching for community and searching for someone to tell them how to do it, from wellness, health, professional development. And when you're in a group where everyone is saying, yeah, your hair's purple, and you're like, I don't see that. It's really hard, particularly if you're young and you haven't had a lot of experiences, to call bullshit.
Absolutely.
Right. So you can
It
be,
was impossible.
right. So you're constantly in this gaslit state
Yeah.
where you might instinctively say, this doesn't feel comfortable, or I don't want to get branded, or I don't want to have sex with this person, or I don't want to live in a way where I can't visit my mom or my family. But everyone around you is like, no, 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 this is what we do.
And can you talk about that a little bit
You
more,
got it.
India? The isolation. I mean, at this time, were you speaking to your family? Did you have friends outside of the group? What do they
Not
do to your
much.
relationships?
I mean, I was not really talking to my family much at all when I was in the group. I mean, phone calls here and there. When I was living in so in the beginning, I lived in Los Angeles and I was part of their LA group and they were trying to build a center there. So that's where I'm from originally. And so it was easy for me to tap into my network of friends and colleagues and people that I had grown up with. And they were very eager for me to do that. And so, looking back, obviously I've gone through many layers of humiliation now after the fact, looking at my, text messages and emails and calls to people that I knew, and I sound like a total crazy person. And so, like, that's also a sign that you are not in your right mind. But every time somebody would say, like, are you okay? Like, that sounds weird. I'd be like, no, it's not. It's perfect. It's amazing. And like the same way that probably a woman who's being abused by her husband might be, no, he's fine. Oh, this bruise, I got this while I was cleaning. Like, you know what I mean? You have a response for everything. So in the group, that's kind of how I was trained. And I didn't have the opportunity to say like, hey, this feels weird, because when you said, hey, this feels weird, they had an answer for that, which was go get an EM about it, which was their version of like a similar tool that they use in Scientology, um, which basically like disconnects you from the memory and from the visceral feeling. But basically, you're going numb. You're going numb to your conscience.
How do you
And
do
so
that?
it's a kind of like a hypnotic therapeutic process that they taught us. So I know how to do it. I've had to do it on myself, actually. Like I've reversed engineered it so that I could deprogram myself. Um, but it's like a process of going back to core memories or traumas and then either hooking or unhooking the emotion or relinking it to a different emotion so you don't have that same charge to the memory. It's really creepy, but it actually works. And it doesn't work on everything for everything, but it works enough to change your feelings about, uh, in my case, my family, animals, career, my body, like all sorts of things that I used to do it on.
Can you talk a little bit, just kind of following up on that, about the different ways you were deprived
Mhm.
while
Uh,
there?
well, I guess deprived socially for sure, because we were not really encouraged to socialize with anybody else unless it was to do with enrollment. And so that always felt very fraudulent to me and really uncomfortable. So, like I said, I'm already kind of an anxious person. So, the idea of going into an enrollment meeting with someone who I considered a friend, and the undercurrent is, I want to enroll you into this group, and I'm actually just going to pretend to be your friend right now, is really awful to me. And like, that is what I had to do over and over and over again. And I was trained to feel good about it, but that actually, like, I never actually felt good about it. So that just like showed me that I still had a little bit of me intact. Um, but yeah, they also deprived food, but that wasn't really until I was in DOS. Like there was a lot of diet culture in the group in general, and they promoted vegetarianism so that people like as a way to be nonviolent. And so I decided for 7 years that I would be a vegetarian, which is like literally the opposite of my whole lifestyle now. Like my husband owns a barbecue restaurant, so like I've really come back to myself in that sense. Um, and they also deprived us of real luxuries and pleasure because it was kind of a group that promoted that Buddhist sort of renunciant lifestyle where like material things didn't matter, and if you were lusting for them it meant that you had an internal issue that you hadn't resolved. So a lot of things that I just like didn't shop, didn't do a lot of entertainment. Like all my money and time was going towards them and the curriculum. So if I did do kind of like one-off fun things, I usually felt guilty about it. Um, and I think that was just like part of their control strategy. And at the same time, I was learning a lot. So I did place quite a bit of value on the group and the curriculum because I wasn't seeing anything else change in my life yet. But I was also in my 20s and without a lot of ambition or direction except for this. So I was actually like a perfect person for them to use because of where I was at in my own life too. So like red flag, if you're in a time of transition, like that also makes you additionally more vulnerable.
Yeah, yeah, I can relate to that for sure. Can we talk a bit about what it means to be a victim and an abuser? I know this is a conversation that Margot and I have had talked about many times in her work. But for certain people in the group, from what we understand or what I understand, is that they were in leadership roles and they may have been the agents or knowledgeable of particular abuses happening, but they were also being abused at the same time, some might argue. How do you hold grace? How do you define the difference? What has that meant for you?
Yeah, that's been really difficult. Mostly when it comes to my relationship with Allison, who was my main abuser, besides Keith. Like, obviously, that was like he abused me sexually directly, but all of his directives came through Allison to me, which I didn't know. So ultimately, he was in charge. And then, to be honest, like, even though I had to enroll other women into DOS, I tried my hardest to avoid anything that they were asking me, even if it meant I was going to take more punishment, because I like still had some of my conscience intact. And I would make light of it, like, oh, yeah, like I'm just scared. I don't want to do it. Like, oh, you want to, Keith's asking for a threesome. Like, I'm not really it. Like, I was just like finding every way to say no without saying a direct no, because I knew if I said direct no, they would make me do it. So I was really good at just like staying shifty and staying like chaotic, kind of, as a strategy to try to avoid some of their directives. But obviously, there were certain things that I did, and that I was also collateralized with an enormous amount of collateral that they had been requiring of me since the time that I had joined. So by the time that other women were brought in underneath me through Allison, I was already heavily compromised, like not even close to what I had asked of them, in quantity and also in just like damaging effects.
I'm wondering if you can, for those, I think Tashira and I know what you're talking about in terms of the
Mhm.
collateral, or we have an idea, but this is another aspect of DOS that if you haven't read about Nxivm or the sub cult within Nxivm
Mhm.
DOS, you might not be aware of what collateral was. So if you can just
It's
give us a
blackmail. It's basic blackmail, but cloaked in an era of self-help, basically, which made it really difficult for me to even see it as blackmail because they were saying, "Hey, give us this information which is going to help you stick to your commitments," basically. And they had like whole curriculums about this concept, which now I find very disturbing and also telling that they were basically priming us for this type of thought process, which is I'm going to give you something and it's going to hold me to my word no matter what. And in theory, like responsibility, that sounds like a really cool practice, but taken to an extreme, you can be hurt.
So they wanted, what sorts of things did they like as
They wanted
collateral?
they wanted anything that would damage your reputation. So like explicit photographs or videos. They wanted anything that would have to do with hurting people that you loved, like your family. And they didn't use these terms necessarily. They used like prettier words. Um, but more or less, it was anything that would destroy you or make you never want to speak about what was going on. So like it was so terrifying that I didn't even recognize how terrified I was of the collateral because it was something that was just in the background all the time. Um,
Of the collateral that they had of you.
yeah, of the collateral they had of me. And like that's been something that's been so difficult for me, even just coming out and talking about my experiences and like having to push through the fact that that's out there. And like I think there's a lot of women out there, it makes me emotional, but like can relate to cyberbullying, having an ex, like having explicit photos that you shared when you were intimate, like all of these things. Like my case was different because I was, being brainwashed into believing that this was good for me, but same level of humiliation and also just vulnerability, like knowing that this is not in my control, but that I still had to go out there and speak and not be a Jane Doe. Like it was scary. And I think like there's a lot of women that can relate to that and that fear is real. And that like even just the other day, a friend of mine told me that her phone got hacked and that like some creepos put up naked photos of her on the internet. And I was just like mortified for her. And also just like how unfair that is. And like how what a violation of your personal rights. Like this is my fucking body. Like
Yeah.
the fact that I believed that I needed to on a whim give this guy naked photos of myself. I never fucking do that now. But like that shows you what state of mind and how much pressure and fear I was under that I thought that I needed to do that immediately.
Yeah, it's the indoctrination and how it takes hold, and you get
Yeah.
deeper and deeper and deeper. So I want to, before we begin to wrap up, just kind of distinguish between what you were seeing, India, between the men and the women in the group and how they were being abused, indoctrinated, coerced into doing things that they
Hmm.
didn't want to do. Obviously, we know DOS was just for women, but were there ways that were different that, for example, Keith or the other folks treated you based upon gender, and how did they also
Mm.
stay for so long?
That's a good one because gender was a huge factor in Keith's education. And like we had whole programs that were really focused on male and female and, everything in between. And we would discuss it as groups, in groups. And I actually found that part of my time fascinating, even though it all had a misogynistic spin because it was Keith's education on like what men should be like and what women should be like. And so it was not an inclusive education, and it was definitely not an education that supported women and their rights. Actually, it was the opposite. Um, and so I think men were generally favored, women were generally used, but both of them were used. And so, like, that's the thing. It's not like all the men were at fault or all the women were at fault, but because it was a system that was hierarchical, that allowed people to rise to the top and then get more power over the people that they had influence on. So that was kind of like how he was able to uh like is it disseminate his roles and just make sure that he wasn't the only guy pulling strings. Like if you're a good con or if you're a good mafioso, like you give other people roles that you never get your hands dirty ever. So like he had that down.
Like Trump.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
People who are really power hungry are really good at understanding how to use other people as commodities
And how to use
and
them to
making
keep
them
their
feel
power.
special.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a vulnerability.
How did Keith, I know this is probably, maybe this is a stupid question, but how did he have time to like hurt so many people?
Because he had a lot of other people more or less acting like slaves to just be in his presence and doing all his work and his bidding for free and actually paying for his lifestyle as well. So he enlisted a bunch of people who were either wealthy, either heiresses that he would then kind of become romantic with, and then he would treat them like shit and basically make them feel good about it and give them like a special carrot here or there. And then, oh, you're my special one. But then, 5 seconds later, he's talking to another woman saying how much she is annoying him. So it's like, it's a bunch of games. He was really good at that. He had a lot of relationships going at once, but really these people did not have their free will. Like they did not have the choice to leave in their minds. They obviously were not chained to the wall or to the room, although there were people who were held up in rooms for days, but you could say, well, wasn't the door open? That's not how psychological manipulation works. Like, if you educate yourself on this, you will never victim shame another person because you'll understand the psychology of why they had to stay and what was going on for them. And it will actually grow your own heart, which is something that I've had to do for myself and for other people because I did not have that kind of grace for myself. I was feeling so foolish and so ashamed and so humiliated about what had just happened that I didn't want to tell anybody. But I didn't have that choice.
Yeah. So that gets us to the point where we talk about the work that you were doing today, India, when you talk about facing this humiliation and overcoming the psychological manipulation. Where are you today? What does your activism look like?
Like you said, I wrote a book, I made a documentary, I've done quite a bit of podcasting and interviews in the past couple of years. Um, and I still wasn't okay. And I wasn't healed. And I was frustrated by that because I thought that all of this speaking and all of this putting myself out there and cleaning up my messes was going to give me the kind of healing inside that I was looking for. But I was suffering a lot with PTSD and just in like a very, very heavy amount of depression that I just couldn't shake. So I put my head together with my mom and we started to just look for alternative options because I was like, Mom, like, there's nowhere for me to go. Like, I thought I was also struggling with an eating disorder that would just like flare up with stress, and then I had no appetite or I couldn't eat. And that was happening for the past couple of years, like nonstop. Even while I was doing Seduced, I was being like, those triggers were happening all the time. And I just kind of was like compartmentalizing it because I knew that I needed to just get through this work and also work with the FBI and all of that stuff for the time that I did to then maybe get to a place of relief. But that didn't come as easily as I thought. So I dove into talk therapy, which I found quite difficult, and also didn't give me the kind of like visceral resolve that I was looking for, which is just to like kind of be out of anxiety. Um, and then I started to think more about psychedelics as an alternative treatment for myself. But because I felt quite unstable with my mental health for the first couple of years when I got out, I didn't want to do anything drug related because I was actually afraid that I didn't have enough control over my own mind, that if I was going to take a substance, I wasn't sure if I was going to come back. And so I wanted to create more mental stability. So I started boxing and doing physical training with weights and doing the talk therapy, dancing, um, writing, all like I started to just do a whole bunch of things to just figure out like what was going to be my little toolbox or arsenal that I could call on when I was feeling completely messed up, which was happening way more than I would have liked to. Um, like I just was struggling to function on a regular basis on a day-to-day with day-to-day
Yeah.
tasks. And it's embarrassing to even say those things, but I also
No.
feel like it's very important because I think I didn't even realize that I was struggling with suicidal ideation for as long as I did. I just had adapted to the normalcy that thinking about dying and killing myself all the time was normal.
Mm.
So that shows you like how dark and depressed I actually was. And so when I started to go into the world of psychedelics, I realized I started with cannabis because it increased my appetite. It helped me have sex, which I found really difficult.
Of course.
And it also helped me just relax and let go of tension at the end of the day. But still, there was something missing for me. So then I kind of went into experimenting with microdosing and mushrooms because I had had so much damage to my memory that I was kind of nervous to go down the SSRI route because I heard that that can sometimes interfere with your memory and your capacity to have like better recall. So I was like, I don't think that's for me. I need the opposite. So although the microdosing was difficult, I started to see the results that I actually wanted, which was that I felt more general wellness. I felt more sustained happiness. I felt less anxiety. I felt more creative. I felt more separation from the programming. And the more separation I got from the programming, I felt like I had a choice rather than just kind of like getting triggered and going straight into a spiral of depression or anxiety. So it was like it was slowing down the whole process for me enough to feel like I could control my own mind a little bit better. Then I started to experiment with MDMA because that's a drug that's kind of going through a lot of clinical trials to do with PTSD. And then I found ketamine. And ketamine has been the most helpful psychedelic for me personally because it actually helped me downregulate my nervous system, which was what I was looking for, which I didn't even know that that's what I was looking for. But when I got out of fight or flight, I actually started to be able to use my mind a lot more clearly. And it was like I wasn't always negotiating around so much fear and anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
I had more time to think or do other things. And there's a lot of science that backs up the use of ketamine for PTSD, compound PTSD, depression, things of that nature, but also for people who have experienced sexual violence, it's a dissociative drug. So that you would think that that would not be good, but actually it is good because if you're used to dissociating all the time, you're just doing that as a way to escape fear. But now, in this controlled environment with a therapist, you're actually dissociating, but you're not going into a fear state. You're going into deep relaxation, which allows your brain to kind of reconfigure itself out of chaos.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like amazing to me. And it's feeding your brain so that you can build new neural pathways. What I didn't realize was how much work it was going to be for me to deprogram myself. And so to actually have access to new neurology and create new pathways that are positive for myself takes fucking work. Like there is no magic pill out there. Like if you have a bad negative thought process or a loop, like if you're just sitting around hating on your body, that's a well-worn path. You've probably been doing it like since you were 15 like me. And like the amount of work that it's taken me to get out of that is like a fake it till you make it kind of
Mm-hmm.
situation. But the thing that has benefited me is that I actually feel the difference. It's not just lip service. But it's a combination of both, like actively reprogramming yourself into the person that you want to be, how you want to think, how you want to feel about yourself, how you want to feel about other people. I just didn't have the bandwidth or the flexibility to do that because I was so used to closed loop thinking.
And always being kind of reactive, right?
Yeah,
I
and
think,
told what to
and
do,
told what to
not even
do.
thinking for myself.
And I think that's going to resonate with so many people. I mean, people outside of victims of coercion. This idea of kind of we can reprogram how we approach life. And like,
You can.
it just takes a lot of work.
Yeah, and I mean, I've got chills right now because if you would have talked to me a couple years ago, I would have said, fuck this shit. I'm messed up to my core. I'm never getting out of this and I want to die. So, like, to actually be able to go from that point to a point where I don't think about killing myself anymore, like, to me, that is a victory. Like, I feel like a lucky winner that I don't feel that way anymore. And I do believe that that option is out there for other people. What we're trying to do with our foundation, my mother and I, is to democratize this type of option for people who may not want to go the traditional SSRI route and may be interested in exploring psychedelics because it does stimulate different parts of your brain. And if you're a creative person, you may be interested in just like taking 2 hours once a week to deeply meditate with yourself, take counsel, like have me time, all the things that we say that are good for self-care that we never do for ourselves. Like this has been my opportunity to actually do that for myself. And now we want to figure out how to provide this service to other people in a scholarship program, similar to the TOMS model, where folks who can actually afford it pay so that other people who can't have the service for free. And right now we're focusing on specifically women who have experienced sexual violence, but obviously we want to expand that.
That's amazing. I also think it's really interesting, kind of this concept of democratizing the use of psychedelics. Tashira and I actually had a live event last night where we were talking about psychedelic use for
Oh, cool.
medicinal purposes and how many roadblocks there are in accessing the medicine. And like specific to ketamine, at least in Massachusetts, I know that private insurance, many private insurance companies do cover ketamine use. However, one of the requirements to getting it is that you have a diagnosis, which, okay, but you also are on an SSRI.
Interesting.
And so
That's interesting.
yeah, so the idea, I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but obviously, but the idea being that you have like treatment resistant depression or your PTSD isn't being adequately managed through talk therapy and Western medicine, but also kind of this modern American healthcare bullshit that you have to like continue with something that's not working to get something that could provide relief. It makes
Yeah.
also no sense.
No
It,
sense.
it makes me really angry. I mean, I don't even get me on the topic of the medical, you know, system because it seems so whack and so out of integrity. Like it's supposed to be helping people, and it actually makes things more difficult. Like when I was in New York, I went to an event for a film called Dope is Death in Harlem, and it's all about like compassionate detox and getting people through drug addiction, but in a way that doesn't stigmatize you as a drug addict or a crackhead, which basically isolates you and makes you a pariah, the opposite of what somebody in recovery needs. So I was so moved by it because they were like, fuck all this legislation. We're going to start healing people here at this clinic. And so they started using acupuncture and acupressure, even just with grains of rice, because they were getting told that they couldn't do this outside of a certain medical realm. And it's basically like telling people that they can't heal themselves, that like you need to now outsource everything in order to heal yourself. And they're like, we're teaching people how to do this on their families so that instead of, sitting around fighting, you're actually helping each other release stress or tension. Like what could be better as a family activity? Like, hey, honey, like come over here. Let me like help you with your day by giving you a little bit of acupressure, and then you do the same for me. Like, that's great.
No harm.
That's great. No harm, no foul. But for some reason, the powers that be don't really want the power in your own hands to heal yourself because that threatens them. So maybe a red flag. Not that I'm a medical doctor and not that I'm saying that medical doctor routes are bad. Not at all. I just think that there should be no setback around empowering somebody to take their health back in their own hands.
And so important for someone like you as well, India, as you were talking about the use of psychedelics and just the way that you understand your brain's neural paths and all of these things. I was like, wow, you have done such tremendous work on educating yourself and learning what it takes to heal. And I have to think
I've
that
tried.
well, that must also be a part of the healing. There's healing in the healing, right? It's like I can
Yeah.
take back my mind, my life, my spirituality, and I can educate
Mhm.
myself to find out what that looks like and then spread that knowledge to other people.
And what that looks like for
Yeah,
me, right?
Yeah.
Because what it's going to be for
exactly.
India is not what it's going to be for you or for me.
Completely. And that's what I like to promote because, like, I could be doing all these things and this could just not be your cocktail. And that's cool too. Like, you do you. And the only person that knows what you need is you ultimately. And that's the mistake that I made. I outsourced my healing and my life to somebody else who I thought knew better than me. But now as I've gotten older and the healing and recovery path for me has just been about like, does this feel right to me? And like, does this benefit me? And even if somebody else thinks it's weird that I need to go take a dance break in the middle of the day to just reset, fuck them. I do it because it helps me. like I can't just be living my life around if other people think that I'm weird or unusual. Like they don't know what it's like to be inside of me and they don't know what it's like to be inside of you. So becoming your own authority is literally like has been freedom for me.
That's so beautiful.
And I still struggle, just so you know. Like that's why I work so hard is because like not every day is sunshine and roses for me. Like sometimes I will have a little dip. I'm a person. Like I get triggered by shit, even if it's unrelated to Nexium. It could just be like, you wake up with a neck ache and you're cranky. So like you just got to find your your own routine.
So we only have a couple minutes left, India, but I'm wondering for those who did follow the trial in New York, can you share a little bit about your participation in that?
Mhm.
And how was that being a witness?
Well, I was a cooperating witness for 9 months. I worked with the FBI in Brooklyn. And that was really intense because I had just gotten out of the group, not even like 6 months, maybe. And so while we were speaking, I was also becoming deprogrammed because they were taking me through a linear process of saying, when did you get into Nexium? Then what happened? Then what happened? Then what happened? So I had to go back in my own memory and try to recall as much as possible to start to put the pieces together for myself. And so I actually found it very helpful, but hard because I was dealing with things that I was having a hard time putting the two realities together. I had just spent 7 years in something that I thought was entirely different, and now I was coming up against an entirely different reality, which was reality. And so that collision actually created what felt like a psychosis in me at times, where like I just kind of lost sense of reality. I would get so emotionally overwhelmed, like that I couldn't speak, and that would happen sometimes after I would go home from working with the FBI for 8 hours. I'd go back to my hotel room, lie on the bed, stare at the ceiling, and just tears would just come out of me. And I was like, what's happening? Like, I just like didn't understand, I couldn't put it all together. So it did take me some time. It even took me 6 months of working with the FBI to even vocalize that something sexual had happened to me. And I remember even saying it like that. I was like, I think something sexual happened to me, but I was like still confused about what it was. And so as I walked them through the details of what I recalled, saying it actually helped me see it for what it was. And it even took me a year to vocalize that I had been raped. Like that's why I have so much compassion for people who have been sexually abused specifically because it's close to my heart. I just like the statute of limitations being as limited as they are to me are insane because of how difficult it is to sometimes recall these traumatic moments where you actually like leave your body mentally. And so I found it both cathartic, educational, to say the least, because I was being educated on what I was involved in and the crimes that I had participated in, unknowingly, and also because of the collateral
Yeah.
and not having a choice to say no without consequences or punishment. And so I got to see Nxivm for what it really was, but then I also had to deal with the consequences of that, things that I had done in reality, which involved other people. And so there was a lot of reparative damage that I needed to do. And I think part of what compelled me to want to do the documentary in the way that I did, which was really like for educational purposes and to like take back my own name and not just be branded sex
Right.
slave. I wanted to be India Oxenberg again. And so I think Seduced really gave me the platform to do that, and to be an executive producer as well really gave me a feeling of power in my own life rather than just getting victimized again, which unfortunately a lot of people do in the documentary and film space. You know, you get used for a story or for a headline and people forget that that's a person.
I'm wondering, India, if you can share a little bit, if you feel comfortable, about kind of the role your mom played in exposing what was actually going on and
Mhm.
helping you extract yourself
Mhm.
from the group.
My mother used every single resource that she had access to basically draw attention to something that was terrifying to her. And she could see what was going on from the outside, whereas like at the time we were basically speaking two different languages, and we needed to have a mediator who also acted as a deprogrammer for me when I originally got out of the group, to even just have us have a conversation. We didn't speak for 9 months at one point because we were in like a stalemate, and I was, you know, protecting Nexium and she was trying to take it down. And I was in a position where I felt like my mom's trying to destroy my whole life and all of my friends and blah blah blah. And that was like where that was the limitations of my sight at that time. And so I think my mom's efforts are really the reason why I'm out. But it's the recovery that we didn't even anticipate would be this difficult. And so that's where her and I have really come to bond in an adult relationship that is different than anything we ever really expected. And I think that's why we've come together on this foundation as an effort to really like heal together, but also, you know, spread the word that this is something that happens to anybody. Doesn't matter where you grow up, what gender or race or, you know, privilege or poor, like this stuff can affect anyone. And that's, I think, what we want to use with the privilege that we have now, which is one, that I'm free and I'm out, and that we actually have access to these platforms to be able to speak about these things. Like, that's the whole point. I mean, use the platform to put out information to actually keep people safer. And so I think that's why I'll probably keep speaking. Um, because I think once you know, you you know, and you really are better equipped.
Thank you so much, India. I just think I know your story is going to help so many people. And you
Thank
continue
you.
to share it in the bravest, most compassionate way. And we
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And you're just this
I'm
example
trying.
of, no, I mean, you are this example of an embodiment of strength and resilience and self inquiry that I think so many of us aspire to, even those of us who might be a
Hmm.
little older than you, India. And so we just thank you so much for sharing your journey, but also sharing kind of what it means to do the work.
Absolutely. And get to the other
Thank you.
side. You are on the other side.
I was it was a steep climb, but honestly,
Yeah.
and I fell a lot, but I feel like I um I just made a decision that I wasn't going to quit on myself again, and that I wasn't going to abandon myself, and that I also didn't like that hating myself into the person I wanted to be was not working for me anymore. And it was like hitting my head up against a wall. So I just started to try different things, even if they seemed foolish or, quote unquote, unauthentic.
Well, also
Like,
just this idea that we assume that healing is linear, but everyone who's ever healed from anything knows that healing is never linear. Physical, emotional, familial, relationship, professional, right?
Yeah.
All of those harms are jagged as we put them together.
Totally. And I just see myself as not really that special at all in this situation. I see myself as one of many, unfortunately, that go through similar experiences in varying degrees. So I just think that the more that we talk about it, the less shame will keep people apart.
Well, I don't know any better way to end than that.
Tearing up. I'm tearing up, y'all.
Thanks.
Okay, so one of the things we do, India, on the podcast,
Yeah.
I don't know if you know, is we try to end any episode, but often the ones that are maybe a little bit more emotionally challenging with
This one was heavy.
with something
I'm like sweating.
something kind of that gets us a little bit more
Yeah.
uplifted
Yeah.
together.
Okay.
And so we're remote, so it's a little harder to do a toast, but we're gonna toast you.
Absolutely. We are going to cheers sisterhood and the power of community.
I love that. Cheers to that.
Yeah, water is good. We're all drinking water, so sometimes it's not water, but today it's water.
Today it is water.
It's early.
It's early. It could be a mimosa later. Who knows?
Well, thank you,
Anyway,
India.
thank you guys.
We will link all of the work that you're doing in the show notes.
Thank you.
And as your work develops, please keep us posted so we can add to it.
We would love
Cool.
to.
I will. I'll let you know what's going on in June, and maybe you'll. I don't know what kind of press is going to be there, but I hope that it gets noticed.
I hope so too.
We got your back.
Yeah, we'll let you know.
Thank you. Thank you guys.
Take good
Have a
care.
good day.
You too. Thank you so
Bye.
much.